Nick always wanted to travel and experience new cultures. After hearing about his mother's cruise to Mexico, he decided it was time. He called the board member who was a travel agent, and she booked his flight, hotel. Nick preferred flexibility, so the agent explained he could arrange activities through the hotel's concierge as needed. On the morning of his departure, he drove to Miami International Airport and boarded a plane bound for Cancun. Once in the air, the flight attendants gave instructions on how to be processed into the country. Nick was excited about the trip, but he also began to feel a little nervous as the reality set in. He was leaving the United States for the first time. The flight to Cancun was the first leg of the trip and was relatively short, taking just over an hour. After landing, the plane taxied down the runway and stopped just short of the terminal. A vehicle with a stair platform pulled up to the plane's door, and all the passengers exited onto the tarmac. They were immediately surrounded by armed military personnel speaking in Spanish. Nick had taken 2 years of Spanish in high school, but they were talking so fast he couldn't understand anything. He didn't dare interrupt them, they sounded angry, so he simply followed the group and did what everyone else did. The military personnel escorted them into the terminal, into a large waiting room, one by one. Passengers were called into a small office where two officials checked their paperwork and asked questions. For Nick, the process was relatively quick. One of the men pointed him to another door, and once he stepped through, he was inside the terminal. Running late, he hurried to catch his connecting flight to Merida. Most of the airport staff spoke English and gave him directions to the correct gate. Nick boarded the crowded flight and took his window seat. He had just sat down when the plane began taxiing toward the runway. This was another short flight, but this time, the attendants spoke only Spanish. About 30 minutes in, the plane began a sudden, rapid descent. The pilot made an announcement in Spanish, and the seatbelt sign lit up. Nick couldn't see anything out of his window but dense forest. The pilot spoke again, more urgently. Nick had flown a few times before, but he'd never experienced such a rapid descent. He wondered if they were about to crash. Scanning the landscape outside for any sign of civilization or an airport, his mind raced. His parents had advised against solo travel, and the travel agent had recommended group tours or destinations with English speakers. Ignoring them, he had come alone to a remote part of Mexico, rarely visited by tourists. Now, he feared he would die here alone in the middle of nowhere. The plane was barely clearing the treetops. Nick braced for impact. A quick drop, a slight bounce, and then a powerful reverse thrust from the engines, and they were on the ground. Looking out the window, all he saw was what looked like a dried-up lake bed. Still no signs of civilization. This didn't look like any airport he'd ever seen. His heart pounded and his clothes were soaked in sweat. The terminal looked like a small house. The plane stopped and a vehicle with a ladder drove up so passengers could exit onto the tarmac. Another vehicle arrived with their luggage and everyone gathered around, digging through the pile. After retrieving his bags, Nick exited through an open gate. Outside, cars zoomed past on a narrow 2-lane road. Then he spotted a man holding a sign with his name on it, standing in front of a taxi. Nick introduced himself. The taxi was a small Volkswagen. Nick stuffed his luggage behind his seat, then he squeezed his 6-foot-tall, 225-pound frame into the front passenger seat, his knees pressed to his chest. As if that wasn't uncomfortable enough. There was no air conditioning and the heat was brutal. The ride felt endless, even though it was supposed to take only 30 minutes. The hotel was a beige, old Spanish-style building. The taxi driver stopped in the middle of the busy street. There was no place to park. Honking horns surrounded them. The driver asked Nick something in Spanish. Assuming he was asking for payment, Nick looked at the meter, which read $110. He thought it was outrageous, but paid it anyway. Instantly, the driver's demeanor changed. He grinned from ear to ear, suddenly friendly, but he still ushered Nick out quickly. Nick dodged traffic until he made it safely to the sidewalk. He lugged his heavy bags into the hotel office, where a young man about his age checked him in. The clerk spoke better English than Nick and was extremely friendly, insisting on showing him to his room, but Nick's head was pounding from a migraine. All he wanted was to lie down and rest. It wasn't long before he dozed off. When he woke up, his headache had eased. It was a little after 11 p.m. and he was starving. He walked down 2 flights of stairs, no elevator, to the hotel office. It was empty. There were no vending machines either. He stepped outside and looked up and down the street. A few small restaurants were still open, and one caught his attention. It looked like a mom-and-pop Mexican diner and was within easy walking distance. Nick entered the empty restaurant and sat near a big window facing the street. It looked like they were about to close. A waitress came over and handed him a menu. It was entirely in Spanish. He asked if she spoke English, and she shook her head no. He pointed to a picture of a hamburger and fries on the menu. She smiled brightly and said, "See." About 20 minutes later, after a long, quiet wait, she returned with exactly what he ordered. Nick devoured the food. It might have been the best hamburger he had ever eaten. The waitress came back, cleared the dishes, and asked something. Nick didn't know what. So, he shook his head no. She returned a few minutes later with the check. It was $15. He couldn't believe it. Nick had been under the impression that food was dirt cheap in Mexico, and $15 was a lot for that meal even in the United States. He had no choice but to pay for it. The waitress took the money and thanked Nick in Spanish. Then, before he could make his way out the door, she reappeared from the back with another man, and they both thanked him again. He nodded his head yes while thinking to himself, these people sure are friendly. The next morning, Nick went by the front desk to talk to the young man who had checked him in. Something wasn't right. Everything was costing him much more than the travel agent had led him to believe. At his current rate of spending, he was on track to spend nearly 5 times what he had budgeted for the trip. The guy listened to Nick's experiences, trying not to chuckle too much. Afterwards, he explained that Nick had been overpaying because he used US dollars for prices marked in Mexican pesos. The US dollar was worth 10 Mexican pesos, so using dollars meant overpaying by 90%. In this non-tourist area, all prices were listed in pesos. Nick couldn't believe he had been so careless. He knew this, but had completely forgotten. The guy told him all he had to do was go to the bank up the street and exchange his money for pesos. There was a sign on the front desk advertising a sightseeing trip to the pyramids at Uxmal later that week, so Nick signed up for it. When he returned from the bank, he felt a little sick to his stomach and his migraine had returned. He decided to lie down for a while. By noon, he was miserable. Stuff was blasting out both ends and his head was pounding. It was so bad he couldn't eat all day, and he even considered seeking medical attention. But he hoped if he could just get some sleep, things might improve. He finally dozed off and didn't wake up until the following morning. His headache was gone, he was hungry, but he couldn't venture too far from a toilet. He needed something to soothe his stomach, so he made a mad dash to the store next to the hotel. While he was there, he got some snacks, water, and medicine. He spent the whole day drinking water and running back and forth to the toilet. Later that evening, Nick heard a knock on the door. It was the front desk clerk. He hadn't seen Nick and wanted to make sure he was okay. After hearing about the medical issues, the clerk called the local doctor for him. The doctor informed the clerk that foreigners often experience this kind of sickness and recommended drinking plenty of water to prevent dehydration. The clerk relayed the message to Nick, who kept hydrating and resting. That night, he was woke up by a knock at the door. It was an older teenage boy, sent by the front desk clerk to see if he needed anything. He spoke broken English. Nick was starting to feel better, so he asked the boy to get him something to eat from a local restaurant. When the boy returned, Nick thanked him and gave him a generous tip. By the next morning, Nick felt back to normal. He debated whether or not to go home early. He probably would have, but he knew he'd never live it down. Everyone would say, "I told you so, you shouldn't have traveled alone." He also knew that if he gave up now, he'd never leave the United States again. His dream of traveling would die. So, he decided to stay. Even though Nick was feeling better, he didn't dare venture too far from the hotel since his stomach was still a little unsettled. He visited some sites within walking distance, a phenomenal Catholic cathedral, a small museum of local artifacts, and an art gallery. By the next morning, the fourth day of his trip, he was ready to venture out, experience more of the Mexican culture. After lunch, he decided to wave down a taxi and head to the open market he'd heard so much about. It took flagging down 3 taxis before he found one where the driver spoke any English. And even then, it was only broken English. Nick asked, "Do you understand English?" The driver nodded. "Yes." He continued, "Do you know where the open market is?" Again, the driver nodded. Nick said, "That's where I wanted to go," and off they went in the tiny green Volkswagen. The driver scurried down the main street, then veered through side streets. Nick was stuffed in the car like a sardine. He felt every turn and every pothole. This went on for about 20 minutes. Nick started to worry. He thought the market was supposed to be close to his hotel. He asked, "Are you sure this is the way to the open market?" The driver kept looking straight ahead and nodded again. They were leaving the city and the surrounding residential area, heading into the countryside. Eventually, they turned onto a narrow street line on both sides with old, rundown, sand-colored one-story warehouses and storage buildings. It was eerie. There were no people, and everything looked abandoned. Nick started to get scared. He'd heard horror stories about Americans being kidnapped in Mexico. Nick asked, "Where's the market?" The driver didn't respond. He asked again, more forcefully, "Where's the market?" The driver abruptly stopped, pointed at a path that ran between 2 buildings, and held out his hand for payment. Nick had a bad feeling. He was certain there was no market on the other side of those buildings, and he had no intention of finding out what was there. Nick paid the man, got out of the car, and waited until the taxi drove away. Then, instead of going up the path, he took off running back toward the city. He was drenched in sweat, parched, and terrified. All he could think was that he was lost, didn't speak Spanish, and might be followed by someone looking to kidnap him. He alternated between jogging and speed walking. Finally, as he entered a residential area, he saw a small, friendly-looking family store. He hurried inside and bought 2 bottles of water. While paying, he asked the cashier, an older man, if he spoke English. The man said no, but could tell something was wrong. He called for his grandson. A young boy walked in and came over to where his grandfather stood. They motioned for Nick to come over. The boy spoke English. Nick explained what had happened and said he needed help getting back to his hotel. The boy told him not to worry, he and his grandfather would take him there. The old man, his grandson, and Nick climbed into an old, rusted-out pickup truck. The boy was bubbling over with charisma and was very talkative. As they rode toward Nick's hotel, the boy told him that his grandfather owned the store, that his grandfather had said he was lucky to be alive, and talked all about his family. Any other time, Nick would have enjoyed this, but he was in a bit of a state of shock. When they finally pulled up in front of the hotel, he thanked them and offered to pay for their trouble. The old man refused the money. Nick continued to thank them as they drove off. Then he went into his room totally exhausted and collapsed. When he woke up the next morning, he decided to go on the sightseeing trip to the pyramids that he had previously signed up for. After an amazing breakfast of spicy sausage and scrambled eggs, he went to the hotel office to wait for the tour guide. Around 10 a.m., the guide showed up in a 1970s hippie-looking VW van. He wore the traditional beige Mexican apparel and a sombrero. His demeanor was that of a happy, laid-back kind of guy. Nick crammed into the small van with an older European couple and two college students from Australia. The tour guide greeted everyone with a jolly, "Hello, my name is Hector." He explained that it would take about 3 hours to get to the pyramids. He would stop at a gas station about halfway so everyone could use the restrooms, grab something to eat, and buy some souvenirs. Then he stomped on the gas and the van blasted off like a rocket ship. They weaved quickly in and out of traffic, daring others to hit them. Once they cleared the city, the roads opened up straight, empty highways with the occasional hill. Hector had the pedal to the metal. Every now and then, Nick and the others would get launched upward, airborne, from their seats as they crested a hill. Nick wondered if he would live to see the pyramids. The one good thing about all this was that Hector's crazy antics and maniac driving made the time fly by. They reached the halfway point in what felt like no time at all. As Nick exited the van to check out the store, he briefly considered getting down on all fours to kiss the ground but didn't want to offend his ride home. After a few minutes, they were back on the road, around p.m. They pulled into a parking area in front of the pyramids. They were more mesmerizing and majestic than Nick had imagined. The magazines didn't do them justice. It was astonishing that a civilization could have built such towering, vast structures over 1,000 years ago. Nick climbed the pyramids, walked through large community dwellings, and explored some of the stone passages. The tour guide pointed out various sites while sharing stories about the Mayan culture and way of life. Nick enjoyed the trip. It was breathtaking, informative, and inspiring. The rest of his vacation proceeded smoothly. He spent time by the hotel pool and finally visited the open market. As he boarded his flight back to Florida, he reflected on the eventful trip and felt satisfied with the experience.